Hello, how are you all? Did you have a wonderful Christmas? I hope you did. Tonight, I pray that our good Lord will give us fresh blessings each day to continue to watch over us, to continue to shine on us, and to remind us of His presence in this new year, even when life gets busy. Tonight, we are going to enter into the study of Genesis chapter 50, which is the last chapter of Genesis. Let me start reading verse 1. Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. 40 days were required for it, for that is how many are required for embalming. And the Egyptians wept for him 70 days. Jacob died, and Joseph fell on his father's face, wept over him, and kissed him. The passing of Jacob was a deeply moving and dramatic scene. Well, in Egypt, a royal mourning was 72 days. Jacob was obviously a greatly honored man. They mourned for him for 70 days. And Jacob's body was embalmed according to this passage. And the process took up 40 days. They probably used the embalming agent natron. So what's the reason for embalming? Embalming served to preserve the body of the deceased. And for the Egyptian, there is a deeper theological significance in this practice. They preserved the body so that it could be re-inhabited by their spirit, Ka, in the afterlife. But the Bible did not indicate that Joseph or his family adopted this complex afterlife theology or ritual of ancient Egypt. The physician it is referring to in the passage are probably mortuary priests who were the expert in techniques of embalming. And the physicians were also involved during their Egyptian ceremonial event for the dead. But I don't think Joseph included them in Jacob's funeral because there's no mention of Joseph using this religious ceremony. And furthermore, scholars don't think Joseph followed this Egyptian ceremony because Joseph did not believe in Ka and the afterlife. He believed in the eternal God who will someday resurrect his father Jacob. Perhaps the decisions of embalming of the bodies of Jacob and Joseph eventually were to soothe the feelings of the Egyptians. Let me continue reading, starting verse 4. And when the days of weeping for him were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, If now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the ears of Pharaoh, saying, My father made me swear, saying, I am about to die. In my tomb that I hewed out for myself in the land of Canaan, there shall you bury me. Now therefore, let me please go up and bury my father. Then I will return. And Pharaoh answered, Go up and bury your father, as he made you swear. So after the time of mourning, Joseph turns to Pharaoh to ask his permission to bury his father in the country of Canaan. Joseph did not address the matter directly to Pharaoh. Instead, he asked the household of Pharaoh. Perhaps it is because he had not yet completed his period of mourning. He was probably still unshaven and improperly dressed to approach the king. Or Joseph wanted to avoid a rejection from the Pharaoh in the presence of his courtiers. Joseph explained in his message that this was his solemn promise to his father before he died. And Pharaoh gave the permission. So why did Joseph need to ask Pharaoh's permission? Obviously, fulfilling his promise to his father, Jacob requires him to be absent for a lengthy period of time. But the scholar pointed out that there might be another reason. You see, the Egyptian West, the place of sunset, was considered the appropriate place to be buried to ensure eternity. And no one buried their loved ones at the east. However, Joseph wants to bury his father at the east in Canaan. So Joseph had to tactfully explain to Pharaoh that this was his oath to his father, that he would bury him in the land of Canaan. Now verse 7. So Joseph went up to bury his father. With him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as all the household of Joseph, his brothers, his father's household. Only the children, the flocks, and the herds were left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with them both chariots and horsemen. It was a very great company. You can see from here that Joseph didn't go to Canaan alone. His family went with him, the adult members of his family, and also the high dignitaries from the Egyptian administration also went with him. And furthermore, Pharaoh's servants, probably they were soldiers, they also went with him. And this shows the great honor Pharaoh held for Joseph, who saved his country from the great famine. Also, another purpose of accompanying Joseph with the Egyptian dignitaries and soldiers, probably for the sake of protection, protecting Joseph and his family from danger in this journey. And you will see in a little bit that the journey of the funeral procession is similar to the journey of Exodus. Verse 10. When they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, they lamented therefore a very great and grievous lamentation. And he made a mourning for his father 7 days. When the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning on the threshing floor of Atad, they said, "This is a grievous mourning by the Egyptians." Therefore the place was named Abel Mizraim. It is beyond the Jordan. This part is interesting also. The funeral cortege has 2 stops. First, the entire group stopped at the threshing floor at Atad, beyond the Jordan, it says. And where is this beyond the Jordan? If the procession was coming from Egypt, beyond the Jordan should be east of Jordan, right? Do you agree? Well, that means they probably had to go around the Dead Sea and ascending up north. The entire group mourned there for 7 days. So this is the first stop. Let us read on, verse 12. Thus his sons did for him as he had commanded them. For his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field at Machpelah, to the east of Mamre, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. After he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. So the second stop only involved the sons of Jacob. It appears that the Egyptian staffs remained behind at the east of Jordan and did not cross over to the west. Only the sons of Jacob carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him at Machpelah in Hebron. This geographical precision indicates that the sons of Jacob went around southern end of the Dead Sea, as I mentioned earlier, and entered Canaan by crossing the Jordan near Jericho. Therefore, the route of the funeral procession for Jacob is basically the same as the Exodus route. Perhaps it suggests the Jordan crossing of the 12th son of Israel anticipates the future 12 tribes of Israel crossing the Jordan to the promised land. After all, this was accomplished as Joseph had promised Pharaoh. He and his brothers and all who went with him returned to Egypt. Verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him." So they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father." Joseph wept when they spoke to him. So after the return to Egypt, Joseph's brothers became paranoid. They thought, now that the father is dead, who would stop Joseph from taking revenge of what they did to him years ago? They didn't have the courage to speak to him directly, so they sent the message through a middle person. The message was, "Please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you." So how did Joseph respond? Well, according to Genesis, forgive, trespass, sin are usually connected to God. Forgiveness is essentially an act of God, according to the Bible. What the brothers were trying to say was, you should forgive because your father Israel forgives. Therefore, God forgives. And you notice the brothers didn't use the pronoun our father. They say your father, implying Joseph's special relationship with his father. When Joseph received this message, he wept. Let's read on. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, "Behold, we are your servants." But Joseph said to them, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones." Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. After sending the message, the brothers came physically after Joseph. Perhaps Joseph invited them. They portrayed themselves before him. Again, we remember Joseph's dream years ago, right? The family, the brothers, they all fell down and bowed down to him. The brothers knew they were at Joseph's mercy because they no longer have the father to intervene for them. They offered themselves to be Joseph's slaves. And Joseph reassured them, as he had done before, that he had no intention to harm them and that he will be providing for them and their families. He again acknowledged that what happened in the past was God's work of salvation. He reemphasized to his brother that he was not God and that he was used by God to save lives. Verse 22. So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were counted as Joseph's own. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. 110 years. This was considered a very long life for the Egyptians. How do we know? Well, it is because a scholar examined the Egyptian mummies, and they discovered that the average life expectancy in ancient Egypt was only between 40 and 50 years. Well, Joseph wanted his bones to return to the promised land. Just like his father Jacob, he had his sons swore to him that they would bring along his bones when they returned to the promised land. Though he knew he would die and not see the time when his sons returned to the land, we can see he expressed clearly that he has the hope and trust in God's promise. His final words were, he said, God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, that's the end of Genesis. So what have we learned from the book of Genesis? The book of Genesis, among other things, we learned that it began the history of this world. It begins the story of God's relationship with mankind. And then it tells a sad story of how that relationship went very wrong, and outline God's promised solution to that crisis, a solution that would reach its glorious conclusion in Jesus Christ. Furthermore, the fact that the story of Genesis begins with creation and the Garden of Eden, and it ends with a coffin and the hope of the Exodus experience, paints us a broader view of God's message for all of us. How so? You see, the first book, Genesis 1, tells us the creation of the perfect earth, and then the sad story of sin and death. But then the last chapter of the last book of Revelation gives us the hope of returning to the Garden of Eden, which is the hope of another Exodus from earth to our eternal promised land. Isn't it comforting? And we are right now in the middle of the beginning and the end. We don't know how far we are from the end, but we know and rest assured from this book of Genesis that in between is relationship between human and the Godhead. The Godhead, the Trinity, wants to relate with us, wants to commune with us. Just like God in the ancient time guided Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, and ultimately the rest of the Israelites. Happy Sabbath, and in a few days will be Happy New Year. See you next week.